This is your World War III update. If you want to catch a big fish, what do you need? Do you rambunctiously slam the paddle against the water and make a bunch of noise and be really aggressive? Of course not. You need a nice, big, juicy piece of bait and a shiny lure and a very strong string and some really good technique to reel them in. If you want to smoke the Ayatollah out of his bunker, what do you have to do? Well, you have to unilaterally declare that there's a ceasefire, to the surprise of Iranian state media and even the Iranian foreign minister, who decided to oblige because Iran claims they never started this war and they didn't want it, and to that they are in fact correct. It was Trump who started the fire that he then extinguished and is now calling himself fireman of the millennium. Now, we need to understand what this is, because at every point throughout the negotiation process, the United States and Israel have backstabbed the Iranians. Perfidy, all the way through. And the real danger in all of this is, because this is just a front so that both sides can rearm, and I should add, since the time that ceasefire was supposed to go into effect, both sides have been lobbing attacks at one another. In fact, the Iranians more so. There was an attack on a U.S. military base as well in Iraq, a serious attack this time by drones and presumably Iranian-backed Iraqi militias. So we know that there's been these violations. We know that this is all bullshit. This is not an armistice. This is not a détente. This is not a peace treaty. This is something that's not even written on a wet napkin. Okay, this is just some tentative word-of-mouth unilateral agreement that apparently was brokered by the same guy who stabbed the Iranians in the back last time. Are the Iranians losing the war? And it was Abbas Araghchi's tweet a way to save face? It's possible. We're going to dive into the details today. But first you need to understand that the ceasefire deal has already been violated on multiple occasions. And I'm going to tell you why these perfunctory ceasefire agreements are incredibly dangerous, because every time they fail, we take another rung up the escalation ladder. We've seen that with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky and Trump. Initially, there was this romantic period, right, where Putin and Trump had this bromance for about a day. And everybody thought, everyone's like, see, Nate, we told you it was going to be all right. And before you knew it, the MI6, the CIA, the SBU were inside blowing up Russian nuclear bombers. And here we are. Russia now today declared that they're going to start mass producing Orezhniks. And the Ukrainians are wanting to join with the Poles and the Baltic states in order to procure nuclear weapons and create their own ballistic missile platforms. What could possibly go wrong? Now, I have a term for this, and it's very important that people understand what I'm about to say. Punctuated escalation is what we are seeing right now. Punctuated escalation. This is not steady slope, incremental escalation. It is in surges. And every time there's a new surge of escalation, it's followed by this period of normalcy and a plateau. And it seems as though, things have all improved and we're in the clear. But of course, soon enough, all that is time for one side or the other to consolidate its forces, hatch an even bigger plan, and then go on the offensive again. In fact, in doing what I've been doing for the last few years, I've realized the times when I'm most anxious as an analyst is when nothing is happening or when the news is very quiet, because that's how you know they're making big plans. You can't make big plans when you're busy. When you're busy doing stuff, when they're busy having skirmishes or drones are flying to and fro, I'm like, okay, this is manageable. This is very incremental escalation. This is not punctuated escalation. And so what you end up having every single time after a brief calm or a supposed ceasefire, the exchanges get more aggressive and worse. And that is what we're looking at the next run up the escalation ladder. Donald Trump is saying, this is the biggest, bestest ever, and they're never going to attack each other again. He actually had the audacity to say that the Iranians and the Israelis, after the ceasefire, would never attack each other again in the history of the universe and space-time continuum or something to that effect. And of course, the ceasefire has already been breached. Now, the reason for that, there's an explanation. If we're playing the devil's advocate, and it would be that it's very likely that the Iranian military and state apparatus is so necessarily compartmentalized and decentralized into these fiefdoms for the sake of continuity of government and national security, they need to have some degree of a distance and compartmentalization. So there could just be rogue elements or people who haven't got the memo that there's a ceasefire yet. And that could be what is causing these continued launches towards Israel. Trump's assessment of the ceasefire was far more convoluted than the Iranian foreign minister, who said, yeah, after 4, we won't shoot any more missiles if you don't. We've been saying that for the longest time, right? This is what the Iranians have said for the longest time. So again, Trump just unilaterally declared that there was a ceasefire, and it was like a game of Twister for ceasefire negotiations, because what did he say? He said something's going to happen in 6 hours, and the Iranians can attack for 12 hours, and then the Israelis can attack for 24. So it was entirely one-sided, right? So of course the Iranians are not going to agree to that. But this is a very dangerous thing, because at every one of these escalation points, we get normalized and desensitized to a new level of hostility. Like, case in point, this whole Iranian thing, right? Back when that shocking event happened with True Promise 1, when the ballistic missile salvo from Iran blacked out the stars in the night sky over Tel Aviv, everybody was completely stunned, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And for many, that was a flashbulb event. They knew where they were when that happened, if you're somebody who pays attention to this stuff. And now, when that happens, it's a nothing burger. Oh, they're just firing another salvo of ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles towards Israel. So every time there's and you would have asked people in between now and then, throughout that period of relative calm, that, you know, everything is fine now, right? You could never imagine a situation like this where you have 7 stealth bombers flying the biggest sortie in America's history using an estimated 14 massive ordnance penetrators, the better part of the U.S. Arsenal of said conventional weapons, which should concern people, because that means that what they have left is tactical nukes in terms of doing some real serious bunker buster damage for the deep bunkers, right? So every time it's more serious. Now, what concerns me is that when this ceasefire fails, which it will, unfortunately, I don't want it to. Okay, I want sleep. I want the Iranians and I want the Israelis to establish peace and not be so territorial. And, you know, but that's just wishful thinking. That's overly idealistic thinking. It's never going to happen. So when the ceasefire breaks, things are going to get much, much worse. That's when U.S. has the casus belli to go to war. Now, Trump probably shot himself in the foot by saying that the Israelis and the Iranians are never going to attack each other again. Again, you can never imagine a world where the Ayatollah will feel safe to exist when their lives are constantly under threat by Mossad agents and spies who are just waiting for him to put himself in a vulnerable situation so that they can take him out. And most people don't realize the psychology of what I'm saying. It's just like a drug addict. Every time when a drug addict first takes a drug, that's the highest it's ever going to get you. No matter what the drug is, no matter who you are, the first time you take a drug, the effect is going to be the most profound because you have no tolerance for the substance. So every time after that, that you get another adrenaline hit of that drug or dopamine hit, whatever chemicals are involved in the pharmaceutical effects of it, psychological, how would you say, I can't remember the terminology, but you guys know what I mean. every time it's going to be diminished. There's going to be a diminishing return. You're going to need more and more of the drug for less and less of an effect. The same thing happens with our perception of these conflicts, in that what once was an astounding, unprecedented event is now commonplace. And before you know it, you're working your way up an escalation ladder. And just like that drug addict who is oblivious to the fact that they are taking lethal doses of drugs and it's not occurring to them because they are so desensitized to the psychological effects of it, the physical effect it's having on the person, it's killing them. And then one day they just overdose and die, right? And so the same thing is true with our perception of how World War III events are escalating around the world. And every time, the time that I am most anxious is when they start talking about peace. Because every single time, it always, especially in the last 4 years, has gotten worse. And the periods have become shorter and shorter. The drop-offs are sharper and sharper. So you can go from the world's going to end and, like the Pakistan-India thing, to completely, everything, oil crashes, the markets go to the moon the very next day, like nothing happened at all. Every single time that happens, we get closer and closer to the brink of an intractable situation that we can't control. So this is going to be missed by a lot of people who have this geopolitical myopia. They can't seem to see beyond a few days of the events that are unfolding. I'm getting alerts right now that Tel Aviv is under bombardment by Iran. And it's like, okay, so did Trump just outright bold-faced lie, and was there no agreement whatsoever? We don't know. We simply don't know. What appeared to be a very tepid and weak response from the Iranians to the attacks by these stealth bombers on their nuclear facilities, yeah, that was weak. That was incredibly weak. On the military base in Qatar, where they basically sent what I presume were 6 of their worst old stock missiles that were traveling at a snail's speed that they easily shot down. They didn't even have the Iron Dome and all the multi-layered air defense that the Israelis had. They shot them down. And it was telegraphed in advance. And, they did all these things, right, to de-escalate, allegedly. But something is just off about all of this. And I'm not buying it. And it's not because I don't want to buy it. It's not because I have a vested interest in things going bad or something like that. I don't want World War III to come. I want my kids to have a bright future. I don't want to be right and have lots of people die in the process. I genuinely do not want that to be the case. But unfortunately, I'm black-pilled. And as such, this is why my predictions typically come true. Because we need to be very critical at times like these. As enticing as the prospect of peace sounds, you have to ask yourself, where is this coming from? Like, if it seems irrational and unbefitting of the situation, then it's got to be. Something's got to be up, right? So all I ask is that people look at the situation critically before jumping to any conclusions about what this is really about. And what you'll notice with this punctuated escalation, as I call it, every time you go up the escalation ladder, because the drug addict becomes increasingly more unreasonable and just delusional about things, they never see themselves for what they truly are. You look at the markets on the flip side, and you see, for some reason, here we are on multi-front world wars that are currently raging. If you don't want to call it a world war, that's fine. That's what it is. This is a global conflict for superiority over the planet and all its resources. Yet at the same time, you have the markets at all-time highs, while debt is at an all-time high. Things that just make no sense whatsoever because it's irrational, right? And so it gets increasingly irrational the more you go up the escalation ladder, it seems. I mean, you could write a book about this shit. It really is fascinating to see what's unfolding here. So that's the inversion of logic as a result of the punctuated escalation, which is for the purpose of panic mitigation. Because if it was a steady slope of incline and it was continuous, people would be freaking the fuck out, right? I mean, if you think about it, if there never was this peace treaty that was proposed today, why am I calling it a peace treaty? It's not even a ceasefire. It was just some bloviations of a guy who unilaterally decided that he was going to stop aggressing the Iranians at a certain time of the day because they need to restock their weapons. That's all this is. It's incredibly dangerous, and however, it allows for people to get a sigh of relief. It allows for people to catch their breath. And then when you go back into it, well, it's not so bad because I've been here before. Crazy, crazy times, man. It's at times like these that I get the most anxious, when things are going or supposedly going well. And it's not because I don't want them to go well. It's because I know that big, bad plans are hatched during periods like this. People need to understand what this is. This is you need to look at it as like a big gang war. Okay? And so these guys are going to say whatever they can in order to win people over. They're going to tell you whatever you can, dangle the best kinds of bait that you can bite on. And that's their name of the game. I guess I don't need to wear their shades anymore. It's nighttime out. So Abbas Iragachi came out today and he said, as of now, there's no agreement on any ceasefire or cessation of military operations. However, provided the Israeli regime stops its illegal aggression against the Iranian people no later than 4 a.m. Tehran time, we have no intention to continue our response afterwards. Now, immediately after he said this, there were some pretty serious attacks on a base that I think the U.S. military had already vacated inside Iraq, on some radars there and some other places. So it could be that rogue actors are not having this and they want to continue the fight and want to continue the pressure on the Israelis. Now, the Iranian bros are saying it is Israel who is on the back foot. To that, I would say, again, and if I haven't already said this, I can't remember what I've said so far in this video, the Americans are the Israeli benefactor, okay? And they basically write the checks. And as far as I know, the Fed has an unlimited amount of cash. There's unlimited amount of cash at the Fed. That good old meme, right? So you can't really look at this as, okay, their argument is that the Israelis have to head to the bunkers and this is slowly impacting their economy. But the Israelis get all kinds of aid, all their weapons they get from the United States for free, essentially. They get financial aid from the United States. It's a bunch of dual citizens. There's all kind of sponsors. There's AIPAC. So, it doesn't matter. You could have all the dual citizens who aren't in BDUs leave the country and Israel would still be all right. And some people won't agree with that. Some people really genuinely think that Israel is being hit harder than Iran. And I don't understand how they can say that. For starters, none, maybe one guy of significance has been taken out and assassinated in Israel versus how many in Iran. The size of the explosions that we're seeing in Iran, the idea that the U.S. was able to bring in, 20 planes, 7 stealth bombers and all their escorts, and were completely unbothered by Iranian air defense, and the Israelis took out all the Iranian air defense. For a person to believe that, it's a lot of cope, and I would caution against that if you are on that side. Okay, I'm David and Goliath. I'm not one of these sadists who roots for the bully to just kick the shit out of the little guy. I'm a person who likes to see a fair fight. And so even though I'm not on the Iranian side per se, I like the David and Goliath narrative. And I'm not one of these people. And this is how you know. It's one thing if somebody was attacking us, like directly, if somebody was attacking Canada or the United States, then I might take a little bit of pleasure of watching us go and kick their ass. But this is not that at all. And there's some people who are just so sadistically inclined, and they just love watching the underdog get their ass kicked. I've never understood that. For me, that's a sign of mental weakness and maybe an inferiority complex of some sorts. I don't know exactly what the psychology of it is. But anyways, I digress. So, yeah, where was I? What was I talking about? Okay, so let's just tune in here and see what's going on with the status of this thing, because it seems to be changing by the minute. Third salvo of missiles launched. So there's people don't seem to know when this ceasefire is supposed to go into effect. 8 different times going around right now for when the ceasefire between Iran and Israel actually starts. Yeah, and I mean, who knows? But like I've outlined, and hopefully I've sufficiently explained, it's very unlikely that this is going to hold. If it does, the only reason why it holds is because both sides are so embattled that they just simply can't fight on. And that could be the case for some. Now, in terms of the other news, as I was indicating before, Russia will provide or will prioritize nuclear triad, its nuclear triad, and begin serial production of the Orezhnik medium-range ballistic missile after proven combat use. It's worthy of note that Putin did meet with Aragachi today, and some rumors indicate that the 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium may have been sent to Russia, and that might have been part of this deal. But we don't really know. And when you really think about that, how foolish is that the Russians or the Americans would agree that their arch nemesis be the one that hold on to the nuclear material for the Iranians? Because the Americans are most certainly in a hot war with the Russians. That's where this started. They started that war with the Russians, and they're still at war with the Russians. So the idea that you would be content knowing that the nuclear material just made its way somewhere else, that's not something that is likely going to inspire confidence in the plan, especially when you have the second, third, or fourth of command, depending on who you talk to, Dmitry Medvedev, saying that there's countries that will likely give Iran nuclear weapons. And of course, him and Donald Trump had a little spat once again on Twitter. Ukraine announced the production of Sapsan tactical ballistic missile, warns Russia of coming spiderweb operations with potential strikes on Moscow. Of course, Ukraine, I always confuse those for some reason, some weird Freudian association in my head with Iran and Ukraine. They have fissile materials, and I'm not sure how much oversight is at these facilities at this point in time. But if anybody could make a nuclear bomb, they have the scientists to do it. Many of the Soviet-era scientists probably still reside in Ukraine. Of course, they have NATO's backing. It's just a matter of NATO allows them to do it, is the question. Of course, that would potentially escalate things with Russia in a way that would be unmanageable. So we would hope that that wouldn't happen, because that would be a punctuated escalation that nobody wants to get to. Okay, some of this news is before all this ceasefire stuff even happens, so much for the Iranian retaliation. What a flaccid, impotent retaliation that was. I understand the Iranians have to be very measured, because clearly they don't have dominion over their skies, and they were getting rocked, all right? Now, despite the fact that proportionally speaking, and this is the only way you could make the argument that it was Israel on the back foot. You know how they say October 7th was like 1,000 9/11s because of the population and the proportion of the population that was affected? Well, you could make the argument that a greater proportion of Israel, because it's a much, much smaller country, has been negatively impacted than Tehran. Nonetheless, Tehran depends heavily on its oil exports. And if it doesn't have that, if it's having its oil refineries bombarded, if it's having its ports bombarded, if it's having to shut down its internet, that takes a dire toll on its economy. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, but Iran has a more resilient, self-sufficient economy as a result of the sanctions. And it's true that sanctions create self-sufficiency because you're forced to build everything domestically. However, it does get to the point where the weight of economic immiseration imperils people's lives so much that they're willing to take a bribe from a Mossad agent. If they're looking at their kids and their wife and they're making the same piddly old pay as they were 20 years ago and everything's gotten way more expensive and their family is in need, then they might be more enticed to rationalize why being a vassal of Western hegemony is better than the current situation that they have. So what I'm saying, the more dire the economic situations, the greater the potential for turncoats, and that's exactly what happened in Syria. Because you had a lot of guys who weren't making a lot of money, and they just, they were half-hearted in their commitment to the government, and so the government fell. And so the exact same thing could happen here. Now, so this is why, yes, as much as Iran is a bigger country, it is stronger, it has a deep, rich history, and the people there are proud and patriotic. People can only take so much, and everybody, unfortunately, has a price. Now, before all this news came out, there were rumors that there were militias reportedly preparing to hit U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And that is now happening, okay? So that is happening seemingly independent. So it makes you wonder who is really in control of those groups. Is this whole thing just an elaborate ploy to frame the Iranians as the ones who broke the ceasefire? Is that what this is? But the way Donald Trump was selling it so absolutely and resolutely was that this was the last ceasefire and this was the end and they're never going to attack each other again. I just don't understand it. I could see him saying in a very statesman-like language, in a more measured sort of language, saying we are on the cusp of reaching an agreement for a temporary ceasefire. That would almost be better than what he did. He doesn't have to come out and be all, sensationalist about it. Because then when it fails, he looks bad. Now, allegedly before this, Israel had offered Iran to end the war, and Iran rejected that. So Iran's thinking, or some people within the Iranian government's thinking, is, look, if we continue to push, the Israelis are going to really be on the back foot, and they're going to be panicking. Now, I don't know if that's true, because the fog of war, right? Iran is now using Baidu, and they fully ditched GPS. Can you believe it? They were actually using the Global Positioning System, which is an American system. This Baidu is like the Russian GLONASS system, is, of course, independent of American control, which is probably part of the reason why they got decapitated in the first place, because they're using American apps, American phones, or American manufactured, designed phones, manufactured in China, of course, and using GPS, and now Starlink. And that's why they want to shoot down those Starlink satellites, by the way. Russia declared their unbreakable alliance with Iran. This is according to the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister. This despite their historical differences, I should add. Now they find commonality and common enemy, I suppose, with the United States. Anyways, not so much Israel. Israel claims that they know where the 400 kilogram of 60% enriched uranium went. And they said that there's going to be many surprises on the horizon. So I'm not sure what they meant by that, if they know it went to Russia or if it didn't and it just went somewhere else. If that's true, then Iran is so heavily infiltrated that it's probably an insurmountable problem for them, if it's true that they know that much already. In terms of the Fordow facility, your guess is as good as mine. Most of the experts say that it's very unlikely that the complex was destroyed or impacted at all. Less of the experts are claiming that, yeah, there probably was some damage. Was it critical damage? Who knows? Who really knows? This just before Trump was talking about regime change in Iran too. So a lot of strange, contradictory, mixed signals, which is characteristic of this go-around, the Trump presidency, with respect to strategic ambiguity. Medvedev had clarified some of his comments. We talked yesterday about his 10-point rebuttal to the United States bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities. And he said, Russia won't supply nukes to Iran, but hints that others might. As I indicated, Ukraine is eyeing nuclear weapons, and they're urging joint nuclear development, with Poland and the Baltics proposing fourth-generation thermonuclear armaments. Germany continues to evacuate its citizens from Israel, so evacuations from Israel continue. Now, I don't believe this idea that 1/3 of Israel is destroyed, but presumably they're getting hit pretty hard as well. We're never going to know the true scope of the damage, though, because they don't want us to. In terms of support for Ukraine, if you thought that was waning, you are dead wrong. NATO's support only grows, with 35 billion euros pledged to Ukraine in the first half of 2025. And this commitment extends through 2035. So do the math on that. That's just in the first half, okay? Donald Trump today was screaming about keeping oil prices down. In any other time in history, if they had this technology and the president was issuing a decree, what appears to be a very communistic-like decree, because understand what he's saying here. Everyone, keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it. If that's not a threat to nationalize the oil sector, I don't know what it is. Anyways, anything is possible. Nothing would surprise me at this point in time if Trump came out and nationalized the oil for the sake of a national emergency. Regardless, in a normal environment that didn't have that irrational inversion that I was talking about earlier as a result of the, what did I call it? The punctuated escalation and the drug addict-like exposure to this sort of stuff. That would have likely spooked the markets, but the markets did the opposite. The oil market crashed, which is crazy because people are just in disbelief, really, that anything can go wrong at this point. It's pure, unadulterated, irrational exuberance at this point in time. Here's what Donald Trump had to say in response to former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. Did I hear former President Medvedev from Russia casually throwing around the N-word as if Donald Trump is one to assess the decorum of another politician, and saying that he and other countries would supply nuclear warheads to Iran? Did he really say that, or is it just a figment of my imagination? He's pulling full-on Don Corleone. What did you say to me? What did I hear you correctly? If confirmed, please let me know immediately, in all caps. The N-word should not be treated so casually. I guess that's why Putin's the boss. By the way, if anyone thinks our hardware was great over the weekend, far and away the strongest and best equipment we have, 20 years advanced over the pack, is our nuclear submarines. They're the most powerful and lethal weapons ever built, and just launched 30 Tomahawks. All 30 hit their mark perfectly. So in addition to our great fighter pilots, thank you from the captain and the crew. Did we just see a trial run on Russia? Did Donald Trump just threaten to nuke Moscow with Tomahawk nuclear-tipped missiles? Because remember, in early 2026, those Tomahawk missiles are going to make their way to Germany, and they have a range that they can hit Moscow from Germany, okay? So was this whole thing a trial run for the real decapitation strike attempt? and a show of force in that they can defeat the Russian air defense. Now, we have not seen S-400, S-500. I suspect that the only thing that is going to save the Iranians at this point in time is more sophisticated Russian or Chinese radars. Because clearly, if you can't pick up 7 stealth bombers and a whole pack of escort planes, yeah, even if it is looking like a flock of birds on the radar, then that doesn't bode well for your air defense. You're basically completely exposed and vulnerable. So unless the Russians or the Chinese have a solution, then it could very well be that the Americans do have a significant edge and do have escalation dominance, not just over the Iranians, but also the Russians and Chinese as well. But I presume the Russians, with combination with their satellite tech and their more advanced missile defense systems and radar arrays, that they probably could detect that sort of activity, but you never know. You just never know. Here's what Medvedev said in response. Regarding President Trump's concerns, I condemn the U.S. strike on Iran. It failed to achieve its objectives. However, Russia has no intention of supplying nuclear weapons to Iran because, unlike Israel, we are parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Touché. I know quite well what this would entail, having overseen our nuclear forces as president, but other countries might, and that's what was said. And we definitely shouldn't be arguing over who has more nukes. All the more so because the New START Treaty, which I once signed with the U.S. president, is still in force for now. The question is, what comes next? Well, the New START Treaty really isn't being completely enforced because the United States and Russia have been at war, and there's no way you're letting your nuclear inspectors into your nuclear bases, especially not after what we've seen with the strategic bombers, which is why they're now all in fortified hangars. So, yeah, I don't know what elements of New START are still being honored. I presume the notification of ICBM test missile launches, so those aren't construed as a real deal. Now, I've put into words, and this was before the phony baloney ceasefire went into effect, what I think Iran's options are. Okay, here's Iran's options at this point in time. Because remember, you still have a rogue regime as far as the Israelis are concerned with 400 kilograms of 60% weapons-grade uranium. Still not at 90%, but 60%, and they could enrich that further, according to their own scientists, in the matter of days. Presuming they have the infrastructure to do so, and I assume that a country with a gross domestic product of $1 trillion, a massive country, could likely do it. And it looks like my battery is going to die, so I got to make this quick. Despite the claims that the Iranian nuclear program has been dismantled, Israel continues launching massive strikes across the country. Why? One, because Iran's program hasn't been dismantled and may in fact now be accelerated, and that's the next rung of the escalation ladder and the punctuated escalation I talk about. Or the real objective is regime change. Now they're walking that back and they're saying, oh, we don't want regime change. Just come to the table once again, right? Perfety. Here's what Iran's options are from my point of view once this nonsense blows over. They need to get nuclear weapons and do a test. That's one of their only options. They need advanced Chinese or Russian air defenses, or they need preemptive counter value or counter force strikes across the Middle East, like real strikes against oil and gas infrastructure, just unadulterated, full-scale, indiscriminate bombardment. I know it sounds crazy, but desperate times call for desperate measures. And this is Iran's asymmetrical Samson option. That's the only thing they can do, or they can choose government collapse and civil war. Those are their options, all right? Okay, so that's all I got for you today. My battery is going to die. I'm probably not even going to have enough juice left to upload this, but we'll see what happens. Thanks for watching, my friends. Stay tuned for tomorrow, because we're going to go up that escalation ladder a little bit more, unfortunately. I hope that it's not the case, but that's what I'm betting on.